So now, in response to the video posting, Quran Why Arabic, a visitor remarked, vagueness of the Quranic language is a disadvantage of the Quran if you think logically. If one is able to interpret a single statement in many different ways, then how would one know if one has the correct interpretation? Opinions on the message of the Quran varies enormously. Some will rationalize that suicide bombing is permissible, others will condemn it. They both cannot be right at the same time, yet each will claim they are right. Think, how do you respond to that?
It's actually a very interesting question. Parts of this question are very valid. There are multiple ways of looking at the Quran, and there are the Arabic language is very rich, so it allows for a diversity of opinion. But there is an illogical jump within the question. It goes from literary appreciation or language appreciation to suicide bombings, which are nowhere in the Quran, first. Second, to the idea of deriving rulings, legal rulings, from the Quran, and how two legal rulings can be derived from the Quran that are completely contradictory or opposite to each other. That's actually not the case anywhere in the Quran. What we do find in the Quran, first and foremost, is that you have literary differences that add to the beauty and diversity of the text. God will say something, and it will inspire people to ponder about it, and it will bring different thoughts to their minds. For instance, God swears by time that's running out. So here's a person who thinks about, when they think about time running out, they think about their own life and how much time they've already wasted. Another ponders about this on the same verse and says, perhaps this is talking about all of the history of humanity and so many failures in human history and how many opportunities humanity enjoyed. Another thinks of, well, the world itself, the legacy of mankind on this earth itself is one big giant lifespan, and it's running out. We're reaching the end of our time on this earth, right? Same statement, but it inspires different kinds of pondering. That in and of itself, what the questioner calls a disadvantage, I call an advantage. It opens the doors to reflection instead of closing them and limiting them. On the other hand, as far as legal interpretation is concerned, the language of the verses or the ayat of the Quran that are legal in nature, Allah calls them ayatul muhkamat, verses that are very firm, and they're very decisive. In other words, the language in them is extremely explicit. And even if there is a variation in how they're interpreted, not so in the legal implications of those texts. So there aren't multiple ways of looking at it. Now to get to the final part of the questioner's concern, and that is, how can you have multiple interpretations? Some think suicide bombing is okay, and some think it's not, and they're both saying they're right. How can that be? That is not the case of the Quran, and people interpreting it differently. That is the case of every major document in history. There are different readings of it, and there are people that interpret it with a particular bias. The Quran statement is, if you come to it with a corrupt agenda, then you will find in it what you're looking for. Allah says, يُضِلُّ بِهِ كَثِيرًا وَيَهْدِي بِهِ كَثِيرًا. The English implying He misguides by means of it many, and He guides by means of it many. وَمَا يُضِلُّ بِهِ إِلَّا الْفَاسِقِينَ. And don't be deluded. It doesn't mean anybody who reads the Quran has a 50% chance of being guided and another 50% of being misguided. Rather, the statement is qualified in the same ayah. Allah says, and He would never, or He doesn't ever misguide anyone at all except those that are inherently corrupt, meaning they came to the text with corrupt reason. There's one thing to come and read a book and let it offer its conclusions to you. Genuinely study a book and let it give you its conclusions. It's another to already have a conclusion in your head and then read a text and read into it everything that will justify your conclusion. And that's essentially the case of those who have extreme opinions of whatever the subject matter may be. If they want to justify that position, they can read into the text what they've already concluded for themselves, and then be selective in their citation of the text and their interpretation. The argument is a genuine reading of the Quran, one that's holistic, one that takes into account the text, the entire text, and how it relates with each other, with every other part of it, and also one that respects the historical context. Right? It doesn't rip the Quran out of its context. Will lead to a genuine interpretation. Final statement I'll make about this is a complaint of God Himself in the Quran about people who approach the Quran incorrectly. Two statements. أَفَتُؤْمِنُونَ بِبَعْضِ الْكِتَابِ وَتَكْفُرُونَ بِبَعْضِ. Do you believe in some parts of the book and disbelieve in other parts of the book? Which also implies, are you ungrateful to other parts of the book? You neglect other parts of the book. You can't be partial in your interpretation. Number one. Number two, الَّذِينَ جَعَلُوا الْقُرْآنَ عِضِينَ. Those who took the Quran and tore it to pieces. They took one thing, this is what it says, that's it. Rather than looking at it in the context of a larger conversation. And this latter bit that I shared with you, it should be given, at least one example of this should be given. Quran says, for example, وَيْلٌ لِلْمُصَلِّينَ. The worst possible destruction will fall upon those who pray. That's a statement in the Quran. If you just take that statement by itself and go around saying, hey guys, why are you praying? Quran says the worst possible thing you can do, the worst crime of all will be prayer. Well, you ripped it out of its context. The next statement is, الَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنْ صَلَاتِهِمْ سَاهُونَ الَّذِينَ هُمْ يُرَاءُونَ. Those who are lackadaisical when it comes to their prayer. They think it's a minor, it's a nuisance in their day. They kind of have to get it over with. And also those who, if they do pray, they do it to show off. In other words, they're not doing it for God, they're doing it for other than God. Nothing more heinous than that. To be disingenuous to God Himself. And what a crime, what an act to do that with. What worse act than the prayer itself. Ripping it out of its context makes it meaningless. So if somebody says, well, my interpretation is you shouldn't pray because it's the worst possible thing. Another says, my interpretation is you should pray, but you shouldn't show off using prayer. These are not two valid interpretations that have the right to disagree. One stands the test of context and the other doesn't. And that's the case with, these kinds of extreme interpretations of the Quran.